الفاقد التعليمي في ظل جائحة كورونا والمنح التعليم عن بعد. ما هي المخاطر على التعلم المعرفي؟ وهذا ليس فقط التعلم المعرفي، نحن نريد كذلك أن نتطرق إلى الجانب التعلم العاطفي الاجتماعي، وهذا مهم جدا. يبقى نحن لا نتناول فقط التعلم المعرفي ولكن التعلم العاطفي الاجتماعي وتطور الفاقد التعليمي وتأثيراته على المدى القصير وعلى المدى الطويل في الطلاب والأطفال واليافعين. ما هي تأثيرات الإغلاق على الأطفال اليافعين في الدول التي تعاني من أزمات؟ بمعنى أن في منطقتنا العربية نحن في أزمة قبل كورونا، والآن سوف نكون في أزمة أخطر وأخطر، خصوصا لدينا بعض الدول التي تعاني من أزمات داخلية. ما هي علاقة إغلاق المدارس وعمالة الأطفال؟ ما هو دور المدرسة الحمائي الذي فقد؟ ليس فقط الجانب التعليمي والعاطفي الاجتماعي، وكذلك الجوانب الحمائية والجوانب الصحية، وما مدى تأثير ذلك على صحة الأطفال، على العنف في داخل الشارع. هل للوالدين دور في زيادة أو خفض الفقر التعليمي؟ وهذه نقطة مهمة. ما هو الدور الذي سوف يتأتى من الفقد التعليمي على ما يسمى عدم التكافؤ التعليمي وتكافؤ الفرص التعليمية؟ ما علاقة الفقد التعليمي بتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة؟ هذا نمرة واحد أو نمبر 1 في الذي نريد أن نهدف إليه في هذه النقطة الثانية. نقطة إلى الأمام، أهمية البحث في هذا المجال للمنطقة العربية. سوف يمكن نشير إلى أهمية المنطقة أن تأخذ هذا الموضوع أخذا جديا، وللأسف كما أظهر البحث أن ليس هناك جدية كافية في التطرق إلى البحوث التربوية في هذا المجال برغم أهمية الموضوع. كذلك سوف نتطرق إلى أولويات هذا الموضوع لصانع القرار وللبيئة التعليمية وللمدرسة وللمعلمين. وما هي البدائل في حالة استمرار الأزمة إلى أطول من ذلك؟ شكرا لكم، والآن أعطي الدور إلى الدكتور عبد السلام، فليتفضل.
شكرا دكتور حجازي. لن أطيل، لكن أقول تحيات مكتب التربية العربي دول الخليج وكافة منسوبيه ومديره العام معالي الدكتور عبد الرحمن العاصمي. ويسعدنا دائما أن نكون شركاء مع اليونسكو ومع الحملة العالمية ومع مركز الجودة، باعتبار أن العمل المشترك غاية في الأهمية. وأرحب بجميع الزملاء والزميلات من كل أوطان الوطن العربي، وأرحب أيضا بكافة المتحدثين. وفقط وباختصار سوف أقول نقطة واحدة، وهي أن نحن في المنطقة العربية نعلم تمام العلم بأن التعليم قد عانى أسوة بكافة القطاعات. يقال بأن منذ 100 عام لم تعاني البشرية مثل ما حدث في أزمة كورونا، وبالتالي باعتبار أن التعليم فعل اجتماعي فإنه قد تأثر بصفة متعددة، بصفته تعليما وبصفته أيضا فعل اجتماعي، وأيضا في نفس الوقت المنطقة العربية كانت تعاني من فاقد تعليمي أساسا موجود، وأغلب المناطق العربية الآن متأثرة بشكل مباشر بالأزمات وبشكل غير مباشر، وبالتالي هناك إشكاليات كانت بنيوية سابقة اليوم أصبحت يمكن أكثر أكثر مشكلة أكبر. وعليه نحن سعداء جدا بوجود لمناقشة ما سيتطرق إليها اليوم. ويمكن أن الجديد في اليوم هو أنه سيكون هناك حديث على البدائل وحديث على البحث العلمي، وأيضا بطريقة منهجية. وسوف نصغي جميعا إلى النقاشات التي ستجرى، وسوف تكون بالنسبة لنا في مكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج دليل للعمل المستقبلي. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا الدكتور إبراهيم، تفضل.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الأخ الكريم دكتور حجاز إبراهيم وجميع المشاركين في هذه الندوة الهامة. أولا يسمحوا لي أنه باسم المركز الإقليمي للجودة والتميز في التعليم أنقل لكم تحيات سعادة الدكتور عبد الرحمن المديرس وجميع منسوبي المركز لهذه الندوة الهامة التي تقام استجابة لاضطراب كبير يواجه التعليم. اليوم الحقيقة أود أن أشير نقطتين في عجالة. النقطة الأولى وهي فجوة جودة التعلم كانت موجودة قبل كورونا، وكان آلاف الطلاب يجتازون المراحل ويتخرجون، وهناك كثير من المهارات والمعارف لم يكتسبوها. هذه نقطة هامة. النقطة الثانية التي أريد أن أشير إليها، ودائما أشكر أخي العزيز الدكتور حجازي، أننا في الدول العربية، ويعني في بعض الدول العربية تواجه أزمات مركبة. هذه الأزمات المركبة من فقر، من عوز مادي وعوز معرفي، زادت كورونا هذا الاضطراب وهذا التعقيد، وزادت من فجوة التعلم، فجوات التعلم والتعليم، وزادت أيضا من الفاقد التعليمي المحتوم. الآن لدينا فاقد تعليم محتوم كبير جدا يعني على المؤسسات، وهذه الندوة يعني الاستجابة بشكل غير تقليدي لهذه الفجوة. وبحكم يعني أيضا بحثي في الطفولة المبكرة، اسمحوا لي سعادة الدكتور حجازي في مكتب اليونسكو في بيروت مشكورين على هذه الندوة، وسعادة الدكتور ومعالي الدكتور عبد السلام في المكتب الخليج العربي، وجميع المشاركين والمؤسسات، أن نقول لدينا فاقد من نوع خطير جدا، هو فاقد فيزيولوجي عصبي. هذا يكون في ال5 سنوات الأولى من الأطفال في مرحلة الطفولة المبكرة، الناتج عن الخوف، الناتج عن القلق، الناتج عن العوز الغذائي والمادي. هذا لا يمكن حتى تعويضه في المستقبل. اليوم هذه الندوة، ومشكور مكتب اليونسكو ومكتب التربية العربي والRCQE وجميع المؤسسات، لدق ناقوس الخطر للتدخل العاجل لإنقاذ أطفالنا وإنقاذ مستقبلنا. الأمل موجود. وفي الختام أود أن أشير أنه من أهم معوقات جودة التعليم والتعلم هو العامل النفسي، وما دام هو العامل النفسي دائما ما يبنى المستقبل بالإرادة. الإرادة موجودة إن شاء الله بوجود وحضور الجميع. تمنياتنا من مركز الRCQE بالنجاح والتميز لهذه الندوة، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
شكرا دكتور إبراهيم. والآن على عجالة سننتقل، لأنه الوقت اختصار الوقت، سننتقل إلى الدكتور حجازي إدريس. ودكتور حجازي إدريس هو يعني خبير في المنطقة العربية منذ أمد طويل، وله أيضا دور في العمل العربي المشترك في مجال التربية والتعليم، ويعني وهو غني عن التعريف، لذلك أعرف به كثيرا، لكن سوف يكلمنا على عجالة أيضا حول الاستبانة وحول أيضا ما هو المتوقع من هذه الورشة. دكتور حجازي تفضل، 3 دقائق معك.
شكرا دكتور. أين نحن من الفاقد التعليمي في هذا المجال، كما أظهره البحث الذي قام به مكتب اليونسكو في يوليو الماضي في بداية الأزمة، ثم كذلك البحث الذي أتى من المشاركين في هذه الندوة المتواجدون معنا الآن. ماذا قالوا عن هذا الفاقد التعليمي حتى نكون نتكلم يعني علميا. البحث الذي تم في يوليو أظهر لنا عدم توفر البنية التحتية في معظم المنطقة العربية، إلا طبعا بعض الدول، ولا سيما في الدول ذات التقنية المحدودة، وهذه البيانات أمامكم. يعني الأغلبية في المنطقة العربية لديها ضعف في شبكة الإنترنت، وكذلك لدينا مناطق معدومة من الإنترنت، وكذلك
أنا طلبت من أول من عندك صور للتعليم بمختلف أنواعه.
النقطة الأخرى، هل التحدي الآخر، هل الكادر التعليمي يعني هو فعلا قادر على القيام بدور التعلم الهجين والتعلم عن بعد؟ واضح أيضا برضو لدينا مشكلة. هناك آراء المعلمين والمديرون ووزارات التربية. معظم وزارات التربية أقرت تقريبا، يعني كما تظهر البيانات أمامكم، حوالي معظمهم يعني 38 أو 40% أقروا بعدم جاهزية البيئة التعليمية أو البيئة المنزلية، وكذلك المعلمين والجاهزية التكنولوجية. إذا لدينا تحديات حقيقة كما قال يعني أصحاب المهمة التي يعني بين يديهم وهم أدرى بها. تحدي إسراء المحتوى التعليمي، حتى يعني إذا كان هناك تعليم عن بعد، لم يستطع المعلمين أن يسروا ويستفيدوا من تطورات وما يعني ما هو في جعبة التكنولوجيا وجوجل وفي إسراء المحتوى التعليمي. واضح أن المحتوى هم يرددون ما يتم تصميمه من قبل الوزارة. تحدي التواصل مع أولياء الأمور، وذكرنا في السابق أن الآن أصبح ولي الأمر يمكن هو المعلم الحقيقي في هذه الأزمة. التواصل مع أولياء الأمور لم يكن بالطريقة المثالية أو الطريقة الكافية. نعمل طبعا بالتأكيد الآن هناك تقدم، لأن احنا بنتكلم من يوليو حتى الآن في تقدم بالتأكيد، ولكن واضح أن طرق التواصل مع أولياء الأمور لم يكن كافيا بحيث يكونوا هم يساندوا هذا الدور التعليم ويعوضوا دور عن دور المعلم. كمان تحقيق الأهداف التعليمية، هل يعني كما ذكر واضح أن هناك برضو يعني أقر المعلمون والمديرون أن هناك صعوبة فعلا في تحقيق أهداف التعلم، وهناك فرق بين التعلم الحضوري والتعلم عن بعد. واضح أن في إقرار إلى حد ما، يعني في إقرار بالمشكلة. نسبة الرضا عن تجربة التعلم عن بعد في المنطقة العربية، طبعا واضح أن عدم الرضا هو الأكثر شيوعا في المنطقة العربية بعد التجربة التي تمت في على الأقل في الصيف الماضي. الآن يعني وصلنا منكم حوالي 507 رد على الاستبيان للفاقد التعليمي في المنطقة العربية. هو لب هذا الموضوع وهو الفوكس بتاعنا اليوم. هذه من الدول العربية، سوف نتطرق إليها، لكن نتطرق سريعا إلى ما مدى الإغلاق المدارس في بلدك. يعني واضح أن الإغلاق كان أكثر من 6 أشهر. شيء طبيعي، كلنا ندرك أن الآن تقريبا يعني سنة فاقد تعليمي، يعني أو سنة اعتمد على التعلم عن بعد إذا كان هذا ممكنا في دولة أو دولة أخرى. فواضح البيانات بتقول لنا 43 أو 44% هناك فعلا يعني إغلاق للتعليم. ما مدى برضه اعتماد على التعليم عن بعد؟ هو كلهم ذكروا حوالي 44% ذكروا أن فعلا أن هناك يعني لجوء للتعليم عن بعد، ويعني معناها في برضه مشكلة لدينا. المواد طبعا تختلف، حتى الاختلاف في الفاقد التعليمي هيختلف من مرحلة إلى أخرى، يعني ومن مادة دراسية إلى أخرى. واضح أن البيانات بتقول لنا اللي وصلت من حضراتكم بتقول أن من أصعب المواد الدراسية التي يحدث فيها فاقد هي المواد العلمية والرياضيات والمواد المهنية. شيء طبيعي أن صعب جدا تعلمها عن طريق التعلم عن بعد. تقييم التعليم عن بعد، واضح أن يعني تقريبا 50% من الذين يعني استجابوا للسيرفي السريع ذكروا ان يعني تقييم التعليم عن بعد غير فاعل. يعني على الاقل يعني حوالي 46% او 47% قالوا ان فعاليه التعليم عن بعد هي ليست برضا عنها. ما مدى مشاركه المتعلمين وتفاعلهم في فترة الإغلاق؟ ونفس النسبة، وده ممكن يعني ده صدق هذا السيرفي، نفس النسبة قالوا إنه برضو التفاعل بين المتعلمين والمعلمين عن طريق عن بعد لديه فيه مشكلة وغير كافي وغير ذو كفاءة. سؤال كان عن أداء المعلمين الأكاديمي خلال فترة الإغلاق، هل هناك رضا؟ فواضح أن يقول لك أحرز المتعلمون تقدما خجولا، المتعلمين الطلاب، لكن أدائهم الأكاديمي أدنى من أدائهم في التعليم الحضوري، وإحنا كلنا نتوقع ذلك. وثم ما سوف يقدم من رفعت هيقول لنا بالضبط ما هو رأي المتعلمين ورأي المعلمين والوالدين. دي مهمة جدا. هل تم في المنطقة العربية فعلا تقييم؟ ده اللي احنا الهدف من هذا الندوة، تهدف إلى دق الجرس المنطقة العربية. 71% من الاستجابات قالت ان لم يتم تقييم لخسائر التعليم، واحنا كلنا نشعر بذلك. يعني إلا قليلا تم في تقييم في بعض الدول، ونريد أن نعرف في المستقبل إن شاء الله ما هي هذه الدول. هل هناك خطط إذا تم تقييم، هل هناك خطط بديلة؟ ذكر كما ذكرت البيانات أنه في بعض الدول أخذت برامج التعليم المعجل والمكثف نوع من البدائل وتمديد العام الدراسي. شكرا لكم، وإن شاء الله حنسمع يعني إجابات. شكرا دكتور.
شكرا سي حجازي، شكرا بمعلومات وبيانات يعني غاية في الأهمية، وهي استرشادية وسوف يتم الاستفادة منها، وأنا أعتقد أنها كانت مدخل غاية في الأهمية. ننتقل الآن على عجالة أيضا لكي نكسب الوقت مرة أخرى إلى الدكتور رفعت صباح. الدكتور رفعت صباح هو رئيس الحملة العالمي للتعليم للجميع، وهو عضو اللجنة التوجيهية العليا للتعليم 2030 في اليونسكو، وهو أيضا رئيس الحملة العربية للتعليم للجميع، ما معنى أنه عمله دائما في المجتمع المدني، وفي أيضا العمل المدني المتعلق بالتعليم، وهذه يمكن في منطقتنا العربية قليلة جدا وفعاليتها ليست كبيرة، لكن وجود أيضا الدكتور رفعت على يعني على رأس الحملة العالمية للتعليم للجميع يعطي الموضوع الزخم أكبر. دكتور رفعت تفضل، يعني 10 دقائق لو تكرمت.
شكرا دكتور عبد. يمكن أول شكرا لليونسكو لتنظيم هذا الحدث. الموضوع كثير مهم وخطر. راح نبدأ في عرض مقابلات من برنامج موقف تربوي كنا قد نظمنا. المقابلة كانت مع الدكتور محمد مطر رئيس البحث والتطوير التربوي في وزارة التربية والتعليم الفلسطينية، وكان سؤالنا لهم عن التعليم عن بعد. فهذا يا دكتور عبد مش محسوبة في البرزنتيشن.
طيب، يعني لأنه نريد أيضا أن نسمع من المتداخلين بسرعة. الله يخليك. الصوت
طبعا يعني مرحلة التأسيس مرحلة خطيرة جدا، وتحتاج حضور وتعليم زاهي. لذلك الطالب الذي تلقى التعليم عن بعد قد لا يجد متابعة من الأهالي في المنزل، وهذا طبعا راح يأثر على الأداء في المستقبل. عملية التأسيس تحتاج إلى اختلاط بين الطلاب مع المعلم، وتحتاج إلى بيئة اجتماعية في المدرسة. إذا لم تكن هنالك بيئة اجتماعية وتعليمية في المدرسة، الأداء عند الطلاب راح يكون أقل، والتأسيس راح يكون متدني جدا. وأتوقع أن الطلاب في المرحلة القادمة يشكلون معاناة للمعلمين وللمدرسين.
طبيعي، لأنه في المراحل التأسيسية لازم يكون التواصل عن قرب، لازم يكون تدريس متصلة مع بعض، المدرس مع الطلاب. التدريس الوجاهي أو عن بعد هو مجرد وقت أو قضاء وقت عن ضياع وقت على الفاضي، وهذا بيأثر على تأسيس الطلاب خاصة بالمراحل الابتدائية، لأنه ما بيكون شخصية. هو شخص قاعد قدام الشاشة أو قدام على التلفون أو على اللابتوب، ما بيعمل تواصل بين المدرس والطالب، وبالتالي أكيد راح يكون في له تأثير على الطلاب خاصة بالمراحل الأساسية. يعني لو كان في مراحل متقدمة أو مراحل بعد التأسيس ممكن يكون في إيجابيات، على الأقل في بيكون نوع من الحد الأدنى لإيصال المعلومة، ولكن طلاب بالصف الأول والثاني والثالث ممكن توصل المعلومة بطريقة صحيحة بعمر 7 سنين و8 سنين. لازم يكون في مناهج تعتمد على الصورة، تعتمد على الأشياء الملموسة، مش على أشياء إنه تلقين.
أكيد طبعا هذا شيء وارد في كل المجتمعات، ولكن بدك تتعامل معه. بس مش هذا هو التخوف الرئيسي. التخوف الرئيسي هو من أن نهمل المواد التي بحاجة إلى مساعدة من المرشدين والأساتذة، والتوجه إلى مواد ممكن الطالب لحاله اللي فيها تلقين وحفظ أصلا هي المفروض أنها تخفف المناهج. بس ما دام المناهج بهذه الطريقة لازم يركزوا على المواد التي بحاجة إلى مساعدة الأساتذة على حساب المواد التي لا تحتاج إلى مساعدة من الأساتذة.
طبعا عندي تخوف. التعليم عن بعد صفة فيه إشكالية، لأن الطالب لما يقعد قدام الكمبيوتر وما في حسيب أو رقيب بشكل مباشر مثل ما بيكون بالصف، المعلم بوجهه وبضبط الحصة، ما بيقدر يضبطه عن بعد لأنه اوريدي مش موجود عنده. فبيستطيع الطالب إنه هو ممكن يطلع من الحصة، ممكن ما يحضرهاش أساسا، ممكن الأهل كمان اللي لهم دور كبير ما يكونوا مراقبين عليه إنه ياخذ مدة الحصة كاملة. مش راح يكون يعني فهم الطالب واستيعابه للمادة زي ما بياخذها بالمدرسة أو بالصف بشكل مباشر، بالإضافة إنه إحنا بنعزز قناعة عند الأطفال بنوجههم بطريقة غير مباشرة لأنهم يضلوا متصلين بالإنترنت والسوشيال ميديا، وممكن هذا المسار
طول
التعليمي
الفيلم
بلحظة
يا
ما
دكتور رفعت.
بحال اتصال الطالب بالإنترنت إنه يتوجه للجيم، يتوجه لمواقع التواصل الاجتماعي وينسى الحصة.
شكرا دكتور عبد. إذا ممكن نعرض الباوربوينت إذا في إمكانية. طيب يعني بداية مشكلة الفاقد التعلمي أو الفقر التعلم هو موجود قبل الجائحة، والتقارير والدراسات أشارت إلى أنه ما يقارب ما بين 40 ل 70% في الدول العربية للصف الرابع لا يجدون القراءة والكتابة، وهذه حقيقة ويجب أن يتم الاعتراف بها. يجب أن يكون هناك اعتراف بأن هناك مشكلة فيما يتعلق بالفاقد التعلمي قبل الجائحة. أن الجائحة تداعياتها راح تكون كارثية. أنا راح أقدم لكم فقط أنه عملنا مجموعتين فوكس جروب، مجموعات مركزة مع أمهات. المجموعة الأولى مع أمهات متعلمات عاملات، والمجموعة الثانية مع أمهات ربات بيوت يعني ما بيشتغلوا وما تخرجوا من الجامعات. الغريب إنه نفس النتائج، يعني أنت إذا بتطلع على نتائج المجموعتين راح تلقى نفس النتيجة ونفس وجهة النظر بين الجهتين. أولاً الكل بيتفق معي إنه نقص الأجهزة للعائلات وتكاليف فاتورة الإنترنت وضعف قوة الإنترنت وضعف المقدرة على التعامل مع الأجهزة والبرامج الإلكترونية من بعض الأهالي، التأخر في توزيع الكتب المدرسية حتى في بعض الدول العربية، والوضع المالي والاقتصادي السيء وعدم القدرة على تحمل النفقات الجدية للتعلم عن بعد. هذه الكل أجمع إنه هذه إحدى الإشكاليات. إذا ممكن الدكتور حجازي بس تقدم الباوربوينت. المعيقات والصعوبات اللي تتفضلوا فيها الأمهات في هذه المجموعات، يمكن تحرك الباوربوينت أخرى سلايد إذا سمحت. غياب الضبط الصفي من قبل المعلمين الكل أجمع عليها، عدم متابعة من المعلم والإدارة المدرسية لبعض الإشكاليات الموجودة، تزامن مواعيد الحصص لأكثر من طالب في العائلة في ظل قلة عدد الأجهزة في المنزل الواحد، عدم وجود مساعدة خاصة بذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة. يعني إحدى الأمهات ذكرت إنه عندها بنت عندها مشكلة في السمع، هي ما بتشارك وما في انتباه أو إرشاد خاص لهذه البنت. غياب الإرشاد التربوي من قبل للأهالي، يعني الأمهات بقول لك إحنا محتاجين إرشاد، حدا يقول لنا كيف نتعامل مع ابننا اللي ما بنضبطش الصبح، بس بدي افيقه يعني باخذ وقت، وخاصه بس يكون عندها 5 معناته هي بالنسبه لها هذه مهمه جديه في ظل عدم مساعده الاباء. الاباء يعني بشكل عام لا يساعدوا الامهات، كلهم ذكرن انه الاباء ما بيساعدوا الامهات، بس شاطرين بس تيجي العلامه، اذا العلامه ضعيفه يقعد يصيح على الولد. في حكوا عن تشتت الانتباه لدى طلب الاطفال، ما بيركزوا كثير في قضيه التعليم عن بعد، عدم الالتزام بمواعيد وبرامج الحصص هذا ايضا من الاشكاليات، ضعف القدره على ضبط طلب الاطفال، يعني الامهات كلهن اشارن انه مش قادرات يضبطوا اولادهم، احيانا في الحصه يمكن ما بيشوفوهم مش بس ما بيشوفوا الا هو يعني طلع وابعد، احيانا بينام، احيانا بيرفع اجره، احيانا يعني حركته كلها بتدل على انه هناك في نوع من الملل وعدم التفاعل مع الحصص، في تركيز كل التركيز على الامهات ومش على الاباء، فبالتالي هذه جزء الامهات ذكروا انهم هم بيعانوا من حاله يعني حياه صعبه جدا جدا، بدهم يتابعوا اولادهم، بدهم يتابعوا البيت وما في مسانده، وهم في خاصه الامهات اللي مش متعلمات اللي بيشعروا انهم محتاجين ارشاد، محتاجين حدا يساعدهم. فبالتالي الان انت في اشكاليه في هذا الموضوع. اذا بتسمح السلايد اللي بعده، المشكلات الاثار النفسيه، وكلهم حكوا عن في نوع من العزله، وهذا الخوف اللي ممكن الواحد يصل لمرحله التوحد الطلاب. في ناس، في امهات ذكروا انه اولادهم ما بيطلعوش من الغرفه، كل واحد في غرفته، وبالتالي حتى العلاقه الاجتماعيه داخل المنزل فيها اشكاليه. ولاحظوا اولادهم عدم الرغبه في الخروج خارج المنزل عندما تفتح، يعني عندما يفتحوا المناطق. بالغالب الاولاد بيحبوا يطلعوا، ولكن في الجائحه في توجه انه عند الطلاب انهم في عزوف عن الخروج خارج المنزل، وهذا مؤشر ايضا خطر. غياب تاثير المعلم المباشر على الطلاب، بمعنى انه المعلم بطل هو الشيء الاساسي عند الطلاب. بقدر احضره فيديو، بقدر اشوفه حدا، بقدر اسال زميلي، وبالتالي ايضا هذه العلاقه مع المعلم بلشت يعني تاثر على قدره الطلاب على مواكبه التعلم. بعدين في هناك اشار الامهات على كبت الطاقات وغياب اوقات تفريغ الطاقات لدى الطلاب. معظم الامهات ذكروا انه في عصبيه عند الاولاد، في نرفزه، بمعنى الوضعيه النفسيه للطلاب فيها نوع من الشد، وخاصه عندما يكون في هناك متابعات كثيره وفي منصات الكترونيه كثيره عند يعني فيما يتعلق في التعليم عن بعد. فبالتالي العائله راح تتعامل مع اكثر من منصه واكثر من مدرس واكثر من وايضا في هناك الكل ذكر
الزمن دكتور رفعت، الزمن لو سمحت.
في هناك الكل ذكر، الامهات ذكروا انه في خلط في الكتابه، يعني في ال الشمسيه وال القمريه في الطاء بيكتبوها تاء بدل الطاء. يعني في كثير من الاشكاليات المتعلقه في الكتابه والقراءه وجدول الحساب بدوا يشعروا على اولادهم، وبالتالي في هناك اشكاليه في انخفاض في المكتب على القراءه والكتابه. الالزام بالدراسه شكلي، وهذا له علاقه بالالزاميه. دير بالكم في خطر على المجانيه والالزاميه. المعرفه تقدم مجزأه، المعلمات قالوا الامهات، المعرفه للطلاب تقدم مجزأه، بمعنى احيانا في حذف مواد ضروري تكون موجود وبيتم حذفها. الخلط بين الكلمات ما قلنا. في ايضا انماط سلوكيه غريبه، في نوع من النسيان لاصدقائهم ولاجواء المدرسه، وهذا يجب الانتباه له. المهارات الحركيه، استخدامهم للمهارات الحركيه ضعيف، وبالتالي في امكانيه للعضلات يكون خاصه للطلاب الصف الاول او ما قبل الصف الاول. فيش استخدام انشطه وامثله كثير في موضوع اكثر يميل الى اعطاء المعلومات. العوده للمدرسه بطلت مهمه بالنسبه لهم، رجعنا ولا ما رجعنا مش كثير، وهذا نتائجه على المدى البعيد راح يكون في مشكله. الاحساس الطلاب معظمهم انهم في اجازه، مش في وضعيه ازمه، وبالتالي يجب عليهم الاستمرار في عمليه التعليم. الطاقه اللي بيبذلوها الامهات تحديدا لاجبار الطلاب بتاسس مشكله بينهم وبين اولادهم، فهذا نتيجه عدم وجود دافعيه قالوا للطلاب لعمليه التعلم. فبالتالي ايضا ذكروا انه التواصل بين المعلمين والطلاب بشكل فردي حسب الفوارق الفرديه والفروق الفرديه فيها اشكاليه. فالتعليم المبني فقط على المعرفه وتوصيل المعلومات عماله بشكل مشكله حقيقيه. فهناك كما قالوا هم هناك عمليه تسطيح للمعرفه. وهناك اشكاليه قربت انهي، هناك اشكاليه للاشخاص ذوي الاعاقه، وبالتالي الامهات اللي عندهم اولاد عندهم اعاقات شعروا انه هم مظلومين، وبالتالي اولادهم لا يوفوا حقهم في قضيه التعليم. ونذكر 4 قضايا مهمه: قضيه التجنب اللي قلنا عنها، اللي هي نوع من الانعزال والانطواء اللي قاعد بيصير عند الاولاد، القلق الشديد اللي موجود عند الاهالي وعند الطلاب اللي ناتج عن الازمه في هذا الموضوع. ما اريد ان اقوله في نهايه حديثي هذا، كما يقول البنك الدولي ستزداد النسبه 25% في موضوع الفاقد التعلمي. يعني بتصير اقل دوله ممكن تكون عندها 60% من الطلاب الاساسيين لا يجدون القراءه والكتابه. هذه المشكله، هذا اللي قالته الامهات بيعطينا مؤشر عن كارثه قادمه. في كارثه قادمه فيما يتعلق في الاميه، قد نعود الى الوراء 10 سنوات. شكرا لكم.
شكرا دكتور صباح. العرض المتميز، لكن ارجو توزيع الباوربوينت لانه غير واضح الشاشه للناس. ارجو توزيعه لان الناس لا تتمكن من قراءتها لانه في تشويش في الصوره. ارجو توزيعها لجميع المشاركين. الان انتقل للدكتور حجازي. دكتور حجازي تفضل.
شكرا دكتور، وشكرا لرفعت، ونأسف لأن العرض كان واضح لأني وصل على الواتساب ثم حولنا إلى باوربوينت فلمشكلة تقنية، فشكرا. قبل أن أبدأ، إن في الترجمة من العربية إلى الإنجليزية والعكس موجودة متوفرة على الناحية اليمين. interpretation you can get the translation. Now our two main speakers, let me introduce Dr. Venkat is I'll change it to Arabic. Sorry. Venkat هو مستشار دولي في مجالات عديدة، وخصوصا في التعلم عن بعد، وكذلك في SDG 4، وله باع طويل في مجال التعلم في الأزمات، وكذلك هو عمل كزميل لنا في اليونسكو في عدة مناطق، وخصوصا في معهد اليونسكو للإحصاء في مونتريال، وكذلك في مكتب بانكوك مكتبنا في أفريقيا، وكذلك يعمل معنا كمستشار في مكتب بيروت، وعمل كثيرا في دول فيتنام، تنزانيا، رواندا، ميانمار، قطر، إنديا. نحن نتكلم عن باحث دولي. فليتفضل Venkat, the floor is for you. Please, we are really looking forward for your presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Higazi. I'm very happy to be part of this very important seminar. And it's also very nice to see Dr. Abdussalam Al-Jofi. I hope he remembers me that we met in 2019 in the Dead Sea workshop of SDG 4 in Jordan. And also very nice to sort of have a very distinguished panelist. So I will straight away now share my screen. Then I will start my presentation. So I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So my topic, my presentation is in 3 parts, and we all know why we are having this meeting. This particular animation in front of your screen, it tells all about the purpose of this meeting, the impact of COVID-19 on learning. So I have basically divided my presentation into 3 parts. The first part, I will briefly talk about some issues related to school closure and learning loss, some current status information that we have now, and what sort of factors that contribute towards these issues of learning loss, and why it's important that we study specific targeted groups while we talk about learning loss. The second part is a very brief sort of discussion on the relevance of studying learning loss from an SDG 4 perspective. And the main part of this presentation is to do with some of the research experiences I have been involved. So I'm going to talk about some methodological issues based on 3 different field research studies that have been involved in India, focusing on marginalized and vulnerable children. And this was conducted between October 2020 and February 2021 in partnership with some research institutions and some NGO network. Okay, part 1. Already we have heard previous speakers talk about how much school closures has affected learning. One of the very recently in February this year, UNICEF has published this data saying that schools for more than 168 million children globally have been completely closed for almost an entire year due to COVID-19 lockdowns. So this is nothing but 1 in 7 children globally have missed more than 3/4 of their in-person learning. That is going to school and actually learning inside the classroom. School closures have devastating consequences for children's learning and well-being. These two are very important as we discuss learning loss, because learning is related directly with both the physical, psychosocial, and also the health status of a child. And this learning loss has deeply impacted more with the vulnerable children and marginalized children. As you can see, the Middle East and North African region, the average days of schools being fully open is fairly small. And it also relates to other regions of the world where similar scenario of more number of average days of schools being closed. But the impact of school closure and long absenteeism is not something new. We have already seen similar scenarios in the pre-COVID days due to various other reasons, such as localized outbreak of epidemic, political and civil conflicts, environmental catastrophe, etc., has led to long school closures. And also socioeconomic reasons also has forced children to stay away from school, long absenteeism, and all has been well researched and documented. But with the onset of COVID-19, remote learning has become a very important sort of alternative, and many countries have quickly transitioned to remote learning since the outbreak came in early 2020. However, as we have already seen, previous speakers warned us about the serious consequences. So also other education experts have also warned about the severe consequences for students missing out on critical in-person instruction. Effects of school closure on students' learning, and found a measurable loss in acquisition of basic skills, particularly for the most disadvantaged children. And this is something that I will be sort of expanding further as we go through this presentation, because children belonging to disadvantaged communities, especially coming from poor households, who are struggling to provide even adequate meals, because there's been tremendous job loss for the families, the parents. As a result, families are struggling to provide adequate food, and they are not able to provide adequate technology required for online learning. And there are cases where we have recorded in research that although there has been a mobile phone at the household level, but access to mobile phone by a child is very limited, because the parent wants to use the mobile phone, and also issues of connectivity. Sometimes they are not able to pay for the particular connectivity. So many complications also lead to that, as well as in many scenarios, we have seen children are forced into labor due to the poverty that has struck as a result of loss of work. So all these have complicated the issues and also has impacted the loss of learning, as well as the psycho-emotional, as well as health issues. Children have been, due to long closures, being within household environment, both physical and mental abuse also has taken place, and also various other factors. So these all have had a direct or indirect effect on learning. This is another interesting data to show how many millions of students have been impacted in the countries with the schools being fully closed. Based on the existing research, a 5-month-long school closure can result in an average learning loss of 0.6 quality adjusted years of schooling. This is a World Bank's projection. So this itself is actually telling us the criticality of schools being closed for a long periods of time. Before COVID-19, school closures and student absenteeism did had tremendous impact, but now we are facing the main problem of school closure, especially for disadvantaged families, are due to digital divide. That is, families are, for economic reasons, are unable to afford technology like computers or internet, as well as issues such as socio-political reasons of people being forced to migrate or being displaced, as well as remote location. In several parts of the world, in countries like India, which has a lot of migrant workers who move between one region of the country to the another region, during the COVID, all these migrant workers were asked to go back to their native places because there was no work. So all these had a tremendous impact on the education of their children. So digital divide is one aspect. The second constraint has been on parental involvement. We have already seen some discussion happening how much parents play the role of a teacher. But then in poor families, often you find parents are not well educated. So they are not able to support the child in sort of continuous learning. And also they are not able to afford enough to have proper tuition or the technology so that the children can log into online learning. Loss of learning, when it comes to why it matters more, because long closure has led to one particular kind of loss of learning that's been reported by research studies, which is students, especially in the primary grades and the sort of early grades, there has been loss of foundational skills, that is numeracy and literacy. And we also saw in the pre-webinar survey also many participants have reflected the same kind of point, that mathematics and science has been seen as most difficult to actually sort of convey through online learning. So children also have found, due to this, some research have pointed out they have lost, there's been some skill loss as far as the foundation skills are concerned. Children most affected in this are mainly coming from vulnerable groups such as migrant workers, refugees, remote and rural communities, children with disability, etc. For example, another major aspect that children have been affected, the learning loss has taken place, is with regard to this phenomenon known as forgetting. That is, children tend to forget what they have learned 1 year back, as well as since they are not in the new school year, which is also happening simultaneously through online, they are also losing out on the current syllabus. So this is kind of creating deeper impact in terms of children be able to follow new syllabus. So lack or loss of foundational abilities will have a deeper impact, not only in the immediate future, but also it has this cumulative loss that over the years that both impacts the academic performance of the children, but also that leads into their later adult lives. So this is a very serious issue. The other reason why we need to study the learning loss is from the SDG 4 angle. As you know, SDG 4, which is dedicated to quality education, the learning loss can push back the progress of whatever the progress countries have made with regard to SDG 4. Uncertainty of school reopening due to the new wave of infection and the growing concern of learning loss also has a direct impact on SDG 4. As we know that already many countries lack quality, timely, and reliable disaggregated data, especially for all the 10 targets of SDG 4, which includes 11 global and 43 thematic indicators. This learning loss is going to further exacerbate or further deepen the impact or basically slow down the progress countries make with regard to SDG 4. So it is very important that we actually document and assess the impact of closure through systematic research. And that will be very useful for planning and also taking decisions later when schools reopen. And more importantly, from SDG 4, which talks about no one left behind. So as we move focus with children from disadvantaged communities, we can prepare better and come up with strategies to address their learning loss at some point when schools reopen. Some sort of catch-up programs can be better developed. Now, let me move to the part 3, which is the most important topic of this presentation. This is on the current status of research. As I mentioned earlier, assessing impact of COVID-19 on learning is very important, at least at the time of school reopening, when catch-up programs can be better designed. So studying learning loss should try to address the dimensions that affects learning at household level, because school closures means children are spending more time inside the household. So I want to present some research methodological issues. This is based on, as I said, 3 different field research that were conducted between October 2020 and February 2021, mainly studying marginalized children coming from remote rural areas, mainly who are being working as migrant workers and remote tribal population and working children. Now, while we doing any sort of assessment, there are few aspects that we need to consider, that is options, because this is very critical in terms of research design. One of the first critical decision is, we need to be very specific about the target group that we want to study, as opposed to studying the general student population. This is very important because of the nature of the times that we live in, with so many physical restrictions and also the problems of safety and security. So one has to have a very specific target group in mind. We need to have a much more broader approach from an SDG angle. And to address that, we want to target all the important critical socially marginalized groups that we want to study, such as children with disability, migrant workers, indigenous groups, working children, etc. So we have to decide on 2 options: either go for a specific group, or we actually identify similar marginalized groups and then conduct the research. The second option, the second issue that we need to consider is with regard to data collection. So we have the option of either we are going remote or online, or we go face-to-face. Similarly, place of data collection is very important. Because of school closure and schools not fully operating, household-based data collection are more viable option. And we also need to think about considering of collecting data from all the key stakeholders, such as school teachers, parents, community leaders, that we can try to do through qualitative methodology. Research methods is another factor that we need to think about. We also need to have collect 2 types of data. One is the quantitative through household surveys, and qualitative data using different methods such as key informant interviews or case studies. And of course, the most important but quite challenging in terms of conducting is actually conducting learning assessment. This is challenging mainly because of its technical nature, about which I'll talk soon. So let me quickly run through the remote online or telephone-based surveys. In the 3 research I was involved, the initial attempts to actually use this method failed because the children are coming from very marginalized communities. Their locations are remote. Many of them didn't have access to technology, so they couldn't fill online data or anything. So, but although most quantitative data are collected now globally using this format, but as I said, it's very difficult on certain scenarios such as the ones I've described. And telephone interviews are also has its own challenges. In our research, we found that length of the questionnaire can be a major factor, because people who are answering your questions, they feel very tired of having to answer a long questionnaire. Data reliability is one factor, because often we find parents or others interfering and prompting answers to children whom you are interviewing. Connectivity and availability of the respondent for the interview at the right time is also a problem. Also, issue of trust. Sometimes because of the person who is asking the question is not visible, so people suspect who is calling and they don't want to give answers. So we, in our research, we went more for in-person, face-to-face surveys, which we found which was more effective, because going to remote areas with no internet connectivity, and also we could have better control over the data. And also this could be, the data could be collected using mobile applications, both online and offline. Although there are many mobile applications are available for online, for data collection, the one that I would really recommend is called Kobo Toolbox. This website is here. This has been developed primarily for humanitarian research. And this has been actually a joint initiative which has been supported by OCHA, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and International Rescue Committee. The main advantage is it's free, and it can be worked both offline and online. So, I mean, a Kobo typical form is like any other mobile app, such as Google Forms or other things. But this is much more built to for the field scenarios that most people work in humanitarian situations. Learning assessment is something which is very important. This is will give the true picture of learning loss. It can answer several questions, such as how teachers can align instruction to ensure all students are learning at the right level. It can also tell the decision makers as to how to direct the resources to schools, teachers, and also which students need the most. And also it can answer questions after school reopening on how far students are making progress with learning, as well as whether students are able to catch up with the pre-COVID learning status vis-a-vis the status after school reopening. But learning assessments, such as large-scale assessments are very difficult due to time factor and cost. But there are simplified approaches available, such as the citizen-led assessments. For example, UWEZO, which is used in Africa, ACER, which is used in Southern Asia, are good examples. And we also tried out using a very simplified model of learning assessment, where we tested reading and mathematics in primary grades 3, 5, and also in grade 8. Survey content is very critical for learning loss assessments. The sample size of the questionnaire, sample size, questionnaire length, the type of questions we want to use, open-ended, multiple choice, rating, recall, all these will depend on the mode of data collection, which I mentioned earlier. Whether are you going to use online, whether you're going to use telephone interviews, or you're going to go face-to-face interviews. This will decide your the sort of the sample size, the questionnaire length, and the content. No matter whatever option you choose, there are certain areas or topics or sections that you can include in your questionnaires. For example, learning context is very important to address in a question, in a questionnaire, such as families, socioeconomic issues, then education status of parents and guardians. And then we need to ask about how children spend their day, spend their time, daily activities. Does children's time use differ by their family's socioeconomic status? We need to also capture some data on the literate environment. Literate environment is nothing but what sort of reading materials are available at the household level or at the community level, such as books, newspaper, etc., including whether there is access to any local public library. What resources do children have available for home learning is a very important question to ask. We need to collect data on type of technology that is available, like traditional media like television and radio to mobile and digital technologies. Then we want to know their views on that, challenges in using, and also asking them to rate their importance, as well as accessing online learning. We need to collect data on whether they are able to access them without any difficulty. Do they get any support from the family for learning? How effective has been the teaching, the content, the delivery, and the timing of these online teaching? Data should be collected. As well as data should be collected on the learning habits, such as reading, how long they read in a day, what type of materials they read, writing, and mathematics. A lot of research is telling how much many primary grade children have even lost their ability to even write their name over a period of 1 year. Even in our research, we found even grade 3 children have forgotten how to even write their name and home address without any spelling mistakes. Another is attitude and expectations towards school reopening. That's something we need to address, as well as we are now collecting information on attitudes and about vaccination, because there is a lot of myths going around. So people are reluctant to take vaccination. So we need to collect that also so that we can prepare better advocacy materials. We also need to collect information on health and well-being through recall methods, such as what sort of, because most of them are poor and they lost their job, we want to know how they managed, whether someone helped with food rations, whether was there any medical assistance, etc. And also other interrelated issues such as child labor and physical and mental abuse. So all this information has to be included in a typical interview questionnaire. And this is how we approached our field research. These are some snaps of the field investigators collecting data. As you can see, they are using the Kobo app on their mobile, and using all the precautionary methods, they were collecting this data. Then here I want to just give you some survey sample questionnaire that we used, just a sample to show you how the questionnaires looked like. This is about literate environment on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, some questions about access to learning during lockdown. What we did was we had different modules because depending on the target group, for example, when with regard to migrant workers, there were two kinds of target groups we had. We had children who are accompanying the migrant worker family and children who migrated for work. So we need to have a filter questionnaire that filtered the two target groups, and then we administered the correct module. I mean, the module that relates to the particular target groups. So that's how we approach the quantitative side. We also supplemented the research with qualitative data. As you know, there are several qualitative methods are available. Qualitative data has the main advantage of going into the subtle variations, information on behavior, attitudes, and people's opinion as to how they had issues in terms of accessing online learning, problems related to abuse, related to mental stress, etc. So qualitative data that we used were basically key informant interviews and case studies. Key informant interview was very useful because you don't need a big group to be available like the focus group discussion. And yet we were able to capture various perceptions on the issues of learning loss from various stakeholders, including parent, the student, the teacher, and the community leader. Here is a sample of a key informant lead questionnaire. What we always call these as a lead questions, where the interviewer takes into account what are the kind of discussion points or discussion related questions that they need to ask. It's more probing and helping the respondent to explain the details. So this is another format. So final words. Definitely there is a need for assessing learning loss, especially among marginalized and vulnerable children. So the learning loss is not only the lost time of not being able to go to school, but also in terms of how much they have lost in terms of learning even within the household environment. And as we have seen earlier, several issues from poverty, socioeconomic aspects, and parental education and other issues have actually had a direct impact on the quality of learning of a child within a household environment. So we don't need to wait for the right resources to be available or a funding to launch a big survey or study. Small, innovative studies producing high quality and reliable information through use of qualitative methods can be developed. Because this is a very critical time that we can't lose further time, because we need to understand how children have been learning, what were the problems, what were the challenges. The choice of methods is very important. We need to select those critical target groups who are most affected. We need to focus on critical issues such as learning access, habits, learning environments, attitudes, perceptions towards learning, etc., as well as use of right methods can predict the extent of learning loss. Learning assessments, when possible, definitely, if it's well designed, will definitely give more insights into learning loss. We'll be able to even measure the skill levels. Results can help plan catch-up programs at school, design effective blended learning, develop good strategies to minimize dropouts, because there's been a lot of children thrown into this area where they are forced to work. And so there is a lot of fear that not many children will be coming back to schools when the schools reopen, especially children from marginalized and vulnerable groups. And also plan effective advocacy for health and well-being issues. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take on any questions. Thank you.
دكتور بنكت رائع جدا. marvelous, very good. I think you have covered all يعني what we want. دكتور بنكت غطى أجزاء مهمة جدا أو تقريبا معظم اللي احنا نريد أن نسمعه، خصوصا تعمق في المشكلة size of the problem من عدم المساواة، تأثير الفاقد على الجوانب المعرفية وكذلك الجوانب النفسية والاجتماعية، تأثير كذلك على مهارات التعلم الأساسية، ما ذكر رفعت سابقا النسيان بين الربط بين التقدم المعرفي للأطفال بين ما تعلمه في الماضي وما هو الجديد، تركيز كذلك وأهمية التركيز على الأطفال في ظروف صعبة والترابط المعرفي. ثم تطرق في الجزء الثاني من مداخلته إلى تأثير الفاقد التعليمي على تحقيق الهدف الرابع من أهداف التنمية المستدامة، وأهمية أن تبدأ الدول في تقييم الفاقد التعليمي سريعا حتى لا يؤثر ذلك على تحقيق الهدف الرابع. ثم قدم لنا خبرته على أرض الواقع، ما البحث الذي يجب وما هي الداتا التي يجب أن نشملها هذا البحث، وأوصى بأن يكون الأقرب والأكثر فعالية هو face to face surveys، نظرا كما نعرف جميعا يعني قلة فعالية الوسائل الأخرى، ولكن هذا هو لا يستبعدها أن تحدث. أخيرا قدم لنا روشتة من التوصيات التي يجب علينا في المنطقة العربية أن نسرع فعلا إلى تحقيق تقييم الفاقد التعليمي، بخلاف توصياته على أي نوع من البحوث، هل هي quantitative و qualitative، وأوصى أن نأخذ الجانبين. أهمية إجراء بحوث حتى إذا لم نتمكن من الناحية المالية، حتى لو كانت هذه البحوث على فئات معينة، وأوصى بأن تكون على فئات خاصة فئات الفقراء وفقراء اللاجئين وما يسمى disability children. دراسات بحثية ولو كانت مصغرة سوف تأتي بالغرض. شكرا بانكت, very good, and really I am sure that our colleagues in the region, teachers, policy makers, they will take this, and as I mentioned, we are just ringing the bell, and we are really, I think now, as I know, World Bank and UNICEF Regional and in support also with UNESCO Beirut, I think there will be, we are going to support countries to start research in this area. المتحدثة الثانية التي نأمل إن شاء الله وسوف تكون برضو مارفلس بالتأكيد، سوف تعطينا بعد آخر في الفاقد التعليمي، خصوصا من عملها في كباحثة أو ككبيرة الباحثين في الاتحاد الأوروبي، في وحدات البحث في الاتحاد الأوروبي الموجود حاليا في إيطالي، وهي تركز في بحثها وفي دراساتها على Inequality، يعني على عدم المساواة الذي حدث ويحدث الآن في الفاقد التعليمي وفي عدم ما يسمى Digital Divide. Dr. Schneff, the floor is you, and welcome, and we really thank you for giving us this time. Thank you. Please, the floor is for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Higazi. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important, interesting seminar. And I think that we see, given the high participation rate, how much this is also perceived to be so important on such pressing issues on educational inequalities during the pandemic. So I share my screen with you. So I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, it's very clear. Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, thank you. So as Dr. Higazi said, I will be talking about learning loss during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I will focus on Europe and what we learn from different European countries. So the main focus of my presentation is really to look at what do we know about what happens to children at home, how much do they learn, and then I will also talk about possible steps forward. So as Dr. Higazi said, I'm a researcher. I've been working on Europe my entire life, and hence I do not unfortunately know much about Arab countries, but some of the data sources that I use also include information on Arab countries because I take part in these data sources. And as such, I leave the interpretation of some of the results on Arab countries to you as specialists on this, but I will mainly concentrate on the European results. So I think, apologies. Yeah, okay. So I think what is very important to bear in mind is that when we talk about school closures due to COVID-19, that these school closures affect only those kids who are in school. And we have still in the world primary net enrollment ratios that are not as high as we would wish them to be. So normally we would like them to be 100 due to measurement errors that they cannot be 100%. But we see that there are countries where we have still a considerable part of children that are out of school, and this is predominantly girls. So while thinking about kids in school who cannot attend, it would be very good still to not forget the priority on getting everybody into school when we can, and to not forget about the out-of-school children. Okay, so what do we know about the learning loss during the pandemic in Europe? So I absolutely agree with everything that Dr. Venkat said. We have a big problem of data. We don't have data available in order to monitor loss of education loss. So what can we do in Europe in some way? In Europe, we use different data sources in order to derive messages on the extent of the learning loss and how children are doing. So they're educational achievement surveys. They are surveys on children in the countries. However, they are not timely surveys, but they give us information on educational achievement before the pandemic. Then we have online surveys that they're conducted during the pandemic, which in Europe, we have a high internet coverage. So in Europe, this is a possibility for examining what is going on with children, what are they doing. And then we have as a third source, administrative data. And these are data that are collected by governments on educational outcomes before and after the crisis. The big disadvantage is there are not many administrative data sources we can build on. So I will talk you through all of these 3 data sources and what we know from them about Europe. So what we know about the pandemic is that it aggravated existing inequalities in whatever field we look. The poorer get poorer, and the people in precarious working situations will lose their job. Those who are disadvantaged will be even more disadvantaged. And with education, it is the same thing. So what is important to know is how big were educational inequalities before the pandemic, in order to judge on how big they will get, and in which countries we are most likely to have a greater share of children who are left behind. So there is educational achievement surveys are quite popular. I think many of you will have heard of PISA. It's a program of international student assessment. But here I show you some data from TIMSS. It's a third international math and science study. So all children, so in each country, children get sampled, and then they all need to answer questions on, for example, a huge battery of mathematics questions. And then for each student, their answers get summarized into one achievement score. And then the average of all students' achievement scores in one country will lead to the average achievement in a country. So here on the x-axis, you see the TIMSS median score. So this is achievement. So it shows you on the left-hand side are countries with lower achievement, and on the right-hand side, countries with higher achievement. And then on the y-axis, you see a measure of educational inequalities. Using these data, we just take the difference between of the achievement score at the 95th percentile minus that of the 5th percentile. So, but what is important is just that at the top are countries with high inequalities, and at the bottom there are countries with low inequalities. And if we just look at Europe, so these are the yellow spots. So Europe is a very homogeneous kind of area. All the European countries have very similar economic development. It's very different than our countries. So you see that there are still considerable differences in inequalities with, for example, the lowest point, LLD, is the Netherlands, with relatively low inequalities, and Bulgaria, BGR, having relative high inequalities. And this is of big importance because if countries already before the pandemic struggled to get low achievers to a higher achievement, then they will struggle even more after the pandemic or during the pandemic. So it shows us already in which countries we need to be super active and attentive to look after children who are lost behind, who are losing out. So who are mainly the children who are losing out? And I think Dr. Wenkert already said a lot about that. So I keep it to very, very, very brief here. What is very important is to look at migrant children, to look at girls, to look especially also at those kids with parents coming from a lower socioeconomic background. So this is very, very important to consider those as vulnerable children as well. So, I mean, it's very obvious that those countries which will suffer most, or in which children will suffer most, are those where the school closure were longest, right? So what you see here is the mean is this weeks of school closure in Europe and in the Arab League countries until the 28th of February this year. Okay. So you see, for example, in Europe, there are huge differences in how much countries chose to close their schools during the pandemic. And the differences are even not surprisingly bigger in the Arab League. So you see, for example, in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, that schools were closed most of the time, also in Iraq. But then there are other countries like Oman and Djibouti, where the schools were not closed so much. So we can see from that in which countries we need to be, again, very extra attentive. But what is quite interesting is also how are educational inequalities linked to the length of physical school closure. So here you see on the x-axis the length of physical school closure in weeks. So this is something, the same data I just showed you in the graph before. And on the y-axis, you see the educational inequalities. So again, countries that are high up have high educational inequalities, and low down are those with lower educational inequalities. And there is a tendency that countries that have higher educational inequalities tend also to close schools for longer. And this is quite concerning to find because those countries with higher educational inequalities already struggle with lower performing children. But given that they tend to close schools for longer, they will have more of these children they will need to help this. Okay, so this shows what the result of this is, that we will in the world, in Europe, but also in the world, we will find that differences between countries in the share of students left behind will increase considerably. We will have much bigger differences in educational outcomes between countries in the world. So that was now focusing on between countries. What is happening within countries? And there, Dr. Wenkert already talked about home resources. The big problem is, and skilled children are at home, they rely completely on the home learning resources. And for example, I show you here for Europe. These are the percentage of people who lack internet access. So you see, it is, for example, in Italy, around 14–15% of children do not have internet access. So they cannot take part. They just cannot take part in digital learning that is organized by schools. But we have, for example, in Norway and Finland, almost everybody can take part. It shows you a big difference in these European countries with similar development. But what is very, very concerning is this unequal distribution within countries. For example, in Bulgaria, we have 13% of students who have whose parents have no tertiary education, who cannot take part in learning. And we have already seen kids whose parents are not so highly educated, have already lower achievement on average, right? But now they have not much possibility to take part in these lessons compared to kids that have better educated parents. For example, in Bulgaria, it's 2%. So you have a comparison of 2% of the richer, let's say richer parents, 2% of kids with richer parents compared to 13% of kids with not so rich parents, they lack internet access. So this leads to big inequalities between countries. So we will see within countries. So we will see that within countries, we will have much bigger share of those kids who are already disadvantaged will further on going even more, being more disadvantaged. And within Europe, you see the picture differs a lot. So I wouldn't be so concerned about Norway and Finland and Sweden, which anyway tended not to close the schools for so long, compared to what's going on in Bulgaria, for example. Okay, so just for comparison, because as I said, that the TIMSS data, also some Arab countries are taking part. And here I just chose you the lack of internet access that children report. Okay, so and I show you that by parental education. Okay, we have in Pakistan, Morocco, about 10% of kids have parents who are tertiary educated, which is very different to, for example, the United Arab Emirates, where this is the majority of parents, right? But you see, what you see is here also that, especially for the countries at the left, you see very much that there's this big difference in internet access and the possibility to take part in digital learning if it is organized, right? Okay, so these were the results from education achievement surveys, but and their big advantage is we know something about children's learning outcomes, but we only know it before the pandemic. But we can draw already, as you saw, quite a lot of conclusions on what will happen in the world and how much we will have inequalities increasing considerably. So, but another data source that we have been using in Europe is online surveys, given that we have quite a good coverage of online digital of internet access. So, and from these surveys, they have the disadvantage that we cannot measure achievement. That is too difficult. We can't do this. But we know what children are doing. And for example, in Europe, for the European Commission, for who I'm working, we have conducted the Kids' Digital Lives in COVID-19 Times survey, which covers 9 countries. But there are also other surveys on the UK, on Germany, on France and Italy. And I just want to summarize for you the main results. So these results where these surveys agree. And the first one is that online learning helps to decline learning loss. And this is especially true for older children, okay? And then there is, as already was said by Dr. Venkat as well, I mean, it is at least in Europe, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all in the same boat. Schools had no clue what to do, right? And in this time, most of the burden on children's education fell on parents, and they are still falling on parents in many countries at the moment. But the problem is that parents have very different possibilities to support their children. And this, again, is an ingredient for increasing inequalities, for leaving these kids behind who cannot get so much support by their parents. And then these online surveys ask parents mainly, and there's a lot of parental concern on learning loss, that their children are learning not enough. But another thing that's getting bigger and bigger, where we are more and more concerned as well, is mental well-being. So these problems of learning loss and mental well-being are especially big for younger kids because they cannot participate well in digital technology. They are more difficult to catch. They need more innovative teaching methods to learn. Parents, that is much more difficult for parents. And they'll miss much more their peers. An older child can be on the computer and have a nice discussion with a mate, but that is not possible so much for younger children. So they are in some ways the losers at the moment. We also need to look at vulnerable children because, as I said, they spend much less time on learning activities, as these online surveys show. They are much more on passive activities like gaming and television, whereby advantaged kids spend more time to learn, which will increase further the differences between vulnerable and not vulnerable children. And in addition, we find a tendency that vulnerable children tend to attend schools with less resources, and hence they also get offered less learning. So this is especially a problem in countries where we have high social segregations in schools. Okay, so how large is the extent of learning loss? Because I didn't talk about this up to now, because neither online surveys nor educational achievement surveys can show us in the future, yes, but then it's very late, right? So we can build on results from administrative data. We have simulation studies, and Venkat was also, Dr. Venkat was also referring to the World Bank study, which is a really good study, which shows that the average effective schooling of students in the world will decrease probably from 7.9 to 7 years. What can we now say directly about the learning loss? And for that, I'm aware only of 2 data sources that allow us for 2 countries to think about this a little bit. And one is on the Netherlands, so the Dutch. There's Dutch administrative data on national primary school exams of kids, and that took place before and after the lockdown. So we know exactly what happened after 8 weeks of physical school closure in the Netherlands. And just to remind you, the Netherlands is a country with very high internet access, so it's quite sure that kids were supported this internet learning to some degree. And what the results of such studies are is that students lost about 2/3 of their learning progress. Okay, and that disadvantaged students, not surprisingly, because we discussed the mechanisms, the disadvantaged students lost out more. Okay, another study is on Belgium, and there the results are very similar. So they show that learning loss so it's very big, and in standard deviations, which is difficult to grasp. What is standard deviation? So mass achievement declined by 0.19 standard deviations. So in order to put that for you into a perspective, I can use this decline and transform it back to the TIMSS data that I showed you before. So here you see just the achievement data of fourth graders, so primary school kids. So apologies, I always focus on primary school teachers with my graphs, because as I said, it's the younger children who are losing out more. So here we have the median achievement of fourth graders. For all countries, as I've shown you before, that's the blue one. So it refers to the achievement just before the pandemic in 2019, okay? And now you see, if I apply what they found in these administrative data surveys, the loss, to these TIMSS data, you see how much the blue bar goes down, because this is reflected now in the orange bar. You see, for all the other countries, I would love to have an orange bar as well, but we don't know. And you see, for example, if you just look at Belgium, you see Belgium is around in the middle of European countries, but the learning loss is so big that Belgium would actually be now, in European comparison, one of the low achievers, you know, if the other countries would stay equal, which we know they won't. Okay, so this learning loss in European countries is essential. Okay, just to summarize the results we get from these 3 different data sources that we can use in Europe. So the extent of learning loss is unprecedented, and it is big. And also mental well-being of students needs to be a concern for us. The rising educational inequalities within and between European countries will increase drastically the percentage of lowest low achievers. Many children in Europe will be left behind. And we have vulnerable children suffer the most in terms of learning loss and mental well-being. And younger children are the worst off than older. So that's just to summarize in general, but what does this mean, putting it a little bit further? Certainly in Europe, we have started huge government spending to help overcome the COVID-19 impacts. And Europe has a welfare state, a big welfare state. It has a high economic development. Europe, it's very likely that Europe reflects the best case scenarios in international comparison in terms of the impact of the crisis, or of the pandemic on educational inequalities. We also need to reflect that especially households under higher financial stress, and this is something that many households now have throughout financial stress due to the pandemic, will find it difficult to send older children back to school after school closure. So we will see an increasing school dropout that needs to be tackled. And while focusing on school closure problems, we still always, as I said, need to give priority also to put out of school children back into some learning kind of environment. And what is discussed in Europe as well is a lot around this, right? Children at home. So this has an impact on women and men. They are working from home. It has an impact on women who, on gender roles, on inequalities, further inequalities in the societies, which is another part. There are so many interlinked things that we need to think about. Okay, possible steps forward. So I now talked about how bad everything is. And I still think there are some ways forward. And however, as discussed, if already monitoring of educational inequalities, of learning outcomes, if already this monitoring is difficult to do, then then it's very difficult to evaluate what works best. Okay, so what I tell you here is what has been used in European countries, but I cannot tell you what is now the best approach because we just don't have the data. And with that, I also want to really confirm what Dr. Venkat is doing, saying we need to collect data, and we need to collect data to understand better the crisis, and we need to collect data to find out what works. So there are short-term actions that we can look at, and then there are long-term changes of educational systems, which is some results that are much more founded because these are results we have for a long time, and we learn in Europe from other European countries as well, and hence I want to present a bit on that as well. So short-term, so given that we know young children are especially at risk, it is the idea would be to keep especially young children in school. Very important, as discussed before, we need to improve digital learning infrastructure or remote learning strategies. We have very different strategies in Europe. So we have some countries that build a lot, most of them build on digital learning. But there are others, like for example, Portugal, they use television. So from 8 to 9, it's a fifth graders, and from 9 to 10, the television program teaches sixth graders and so on. So they use television, they use radios in order for children to learn. And then it is the school who then send the exercises for kids to work on, given what they watched in television. To provide opportunities for training to teachers. That is very important because changing to remote learning is a big effort for teachers. There's research showing that teachers are under huge mental stress and suffer also mental well-being because a lot is on their shoulders. All these changes are new and it's on their shoulders. And for that, it helps a lot if teachers can share good practices, if they put themselves together, if there are networks among teachers to learn from each other what has worked. Also to provide home learning resources. So we have countries that distributed tablets to those households where kids didn't have any gadgets in order to take part, or to provide books, just that kids have books to read, because already reading at home makes such a big difference. Then very important is also to rely on formative assessment of students, so that teachers know how they are doing, and also to assess how they make them better, what they're the best teaching approaches to make them better. Then, as many of you have in the interview in the questionnaire before said, plans for extending school time is a very good way to do, whether you have suddenly day school to catch up during holidays or so on. So the longer you can get kids into education institutions together, the lower the inequalities will be. And student mentoring has been shown to be quite helpful, especially for vulnerable students. So in the long term, the idea would be to decrease educational inequality, so that in the long term countries can look after those kids who are left behind and improve their educational achievement. And one big thing that we have, so in Europe, our messages are, for example, increasing provisions for early school childhood education. I mean, that is worldwide. We know that this helps so much to tackle educational inequalities and to keep everybody in. Great repetition is normally increasing inequalities. It's not a good idea. It penalizes a birth of students. Early tracking of students is not a good idea either. Parental school choices is also increasing inequalities. But what normally helps is to provide more funding to those schools who have more vulnerable children attending. In addition, we found that flexible primary to secondary school pathways help a lot to tackle inequalities. And certainly, as the main thing is, we need to know more. We need to collect data on educational outcomes of students. And if it is only, as Dr. Venkat said, if it is only on small areas, on a small group of people, the main thing, it needs to be representative for a specific group, and we need to have good data. So as Dr. Venkat said, to ask for many things that are important for understanding, but more data collection, either at the national, at the regional, whatever level. This is important to benchmark our progress. And what is also important is to, given that we have this crisis, we need to spend more on education. So with that, I finished, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Schneff, thank you. This is also marvelous. Thank you very much. I think Dr. Schneff also tackled other issues related to learning loss. So I'll do it and just summarize in Arabic. دكتور شنيف يعني فوكس على تأثير الأزمة والفاقد التعليمي على تكافؤ الفرص، ومدى الإقفال كان في المنطقة العربية يمكن الإقفال أطول من الإقفال في أوروبا. وكذلك تطرقت على دراستين حدثت في هولندا وفي بلجيكا، ووضحت الدراستين مدى أن الفاقد التعليمي كان كبيرا مقارنة قبل الجائحة والآن. حسب الدراستين أظهروا في تيمس أن هناك فارق كبير بين الاتشيفمنت الليرنينج اتشيفمنت الذي حدث كان منخفضا بعد الجائحة. كمان قدمت لنا نصائح على شورت تيرم اند لونج تيرم، وركزت كثيرا على دعم التعلم الرقمي للطلاب، وكذلك انفست مور الاستثمار باكثر في تدريب المعلمين، والاهتمام ايضا بالتعلم المنزلي وتقديم الدعم للوالدين. تكلمت بالخصوص على المستوى التعليمي، علاقه المستوى التعليمي للوالدين ومدى تاثيره على المساواه والكفاءات التعليميه، وكذلك عدم تكافؤ الفرص بين الوالدين المتعلمين وغير المتعلمين. ونصحت بقيام بدراسات ولو صغيره كما فانكت ذكر، ان الدراسات مهما تكون صغيره سواء كانت دراسات وطنيه او اقليميه بالتاكيد سوف تساعدنا في يعني تقليل على الاقل من الفاقد التعليمي. ركزت ايضا على الاطفال في ظروف صعبه واهميه اجراء البحوث لتدارك مدى تاثير الفاقد التعليمي على الاطفال في ظروف صعبه، وكذلك ذكرت ان المشكله ما زالت في اوروبا برغم الكفرج الكبير للانترنت والمستوى التعليمي يمكن للوالدين والعائله في هذا المجال. دكتور شنيف, thank you. And now I think we are turning to the questions. Some questions are coming from المشاركين. Dr. Ibrahim, and also some question for me and for Dr. Schneef and also for Venkat. Dr. Ibrahim, okay, let me just start with a question that came to me. يمكن أنا ذكرت على كلمة التعلم المعرفي، يمكن المقصود اللي قصدت به ما الفرق بين الفاقد التعليمي من الناحية الأكاديمية والفاقد التعليمي ليس فقط يكون أن نقدره وأن نقيسه من الناحية المعرفية من التعليم المعرفي الأكاديمي، ده اللي قصدته، ولكن لابد أن نقيس أيضا أن هناك دور للمدرسة في بناء العلاقات الاجتماعية بين الطلاب وما يسمى بالتعليم يعني العاطفي الاجتماعي. هذا هو دور لابد أن يكون يعني القياس والتقييم للفاقد التعليمي لا يشمل فقط الجوانب المعرفية والقراءة والكتابة والحساب، ولكن لابد أن نتطرق على الناحية الكيفية على الأقل إلى الجوانب الأخرى من حياة الطفل ودور المدرسة في كوسيلة اجتماعية للطلاب وحتى للمعلمين أنفسهم. يعني هذه الجوانب النفسية للمعلمين وللطلاب ومدى تأثير هذا على يعني إذا كان هناك فاقدا لهذا الشيء. وهذا كما يمكن ذكرنا الندوة ذكرت وركزت على أن الفاقد التعليمي والفاقد العاطفي والفاقد الإنساني، لأن المدرسة دور إنساني. هذا يمكن السؤال كان مقترح عليه. سؤال آخر، ما المفقود في التعليم عن بعد؟ المعارف، المهارات، الكفايات، الاتجاهات. كل ذلك مفقود. يعني هناك فقد تعليمي وهناك فقد للمهارات الأساسية سواء كانت أكاديمية أو سواء كانت مهارات اجتماعية، وكذلك في الكفاءات والاتجاهات الاجتماعية سوف هذا يكون مفقود، حتى لأن بعض الدراسات يمكن ذكرت أن في زيادة في العنف بعد هذا التوجه إلى التعليم عن بعد، كون أن المدرسة ما زالت بتقوم بدور حمائي ودور يعني علاج للمشكلات الاجتماعية في المجتمعات المحلية خصوصا في المناطق الفقيرة. Another question, just I'll put this question to Venkat. Venkat, the question is in Arabic. ما مقترحات التقييم والتقويم خلال فترة الجوائح مثل جائحة كورونا? I think you, if you can summarize this, I think you put it in your presentation. What are the suggestions to do? You can just repeat again for how can we assess learning loss.
Dr. Higazi, I'm not able to hear you well.
Yeah, just the question is how, again, I know you put it in very clear in your presentation. I think they want you to repeat just or summarize what are your suggestions to really do this, conduct learning loss assessment.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing is, I think we have to, we should not be very ambitious because of so many restrictions and so many challenges in actually reaching out to the learners. We have to be very, very clear in terms of which target groups we want to really address. We want to collect data, primarily because we do know that in comparison, some children, at least coming from economically better families, may have educated parents who will be able to help them. They may have access to technology so that they can continue their online learning. Much of our discussions has been about those who have been left behind. So we need to be very clear as to whom are we going to focus. Then I also mentioned about the research methodologies that we have to employ. But research methods normally involves the necessary resources, both the human resource as well as the financial resource. Third thing is we should come up with something quick in terms of the kind of tools that we want to develop. And I personally felt in-phase data collection is much better because we can actually go to the field with all the necessary precautions, but we'll be able to collect better data. But we have to employ both the quantitative and qualitative mix of data because that will help us to understand the subtler, because we are talking about psychosocial issues, issues of mental health and other life skill areas. So all these things we cannot necessarily collect only through quantitative tools, but we need to resort to qualitative information, as well as finally that we need to come out with results as quick as possible, because policymakers and planners, they need this information. So we may think of doing such quick studies at different points in time so that we'll be able to track and monitor the learning among the marginalized and vulnerable children. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just another question for you, then I'll give the other for Dr. Schneff. What is the impact of the learning loss now on at longer term at a national level? Will this have a real impact on the competences and the output of education at a national level?
Yes, it's going to really, have a major setback is in terms of the acquisition of skills. And I personally feel that this will have a greater impact among the early graders, especially the primary and the lower secondary, because the acquisition of the sort of basic skills, the literacy, we are talking about reading, writing, and math skills, they are in the formative years. So if they are going to lose out on that skills, that's going to affect their entire learning and in their sort of later years. And setting that back on track is be a huge challenge. So it is very critical that we try to address this. As I mentioned that if there are enough resources and adequate human resources also available, quick learning assessments would give us a much more precise picture on the cognitive levels of children in terms of their learning with vis-a-vis the literacy and numeracy skills. I think without that, we can't go into the phase in the future that when schools reopen, we can't say that things are back to normal and we can just start from wherever we have left. Because these study results have a larger implication on teacher training, curriculum development, and also the pedagogical methods. And in the future, we are going to use a lot of blended learning. So how are we going to design these things? Because right now, it's not been well thought about. So good research studies, if possible, learning assessments can really help us plan not only in the immediate future, but also the long-term perspective. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Venkat. My other two questions to Dr. Schneef. The first question is really taking us to other side. The impact of learning loss, but also COVID-19 on teachers. How can we support psychologically teachers and parents? What kind of support can we give to teacher and parents as well as students? So let us focus on the teachers themselves.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. I think this is a really highly important question because, as we know from surveys, teachers feel a huge pressure knowing that it's on their shoulders to change to a different learning style to which they are not prepared. For example, in the OECD, it's 40% of teachers who said in 2018 they are not really prepared for online teaching. You know, so for them it is a big effort, big struggle to teach. And to teach also realizing that they have very different levels of kids' attention on the screen if they teach online. So what support we can give to them? I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer as well, right? So from what we know, there are teacher networks that exist where teachers support each other. That is one important point, that teachers can learn from each other. But how best to tackle that and realize that they're not sitting alone, but that they are doing this together for a very good cause. And the second thing would be to provide learning possibilities for teachers to get more acquainted to this very unusual situation for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Just another question, actually, maybe you or Venkat can. We feel and we all know that the learning lost at grades, earlier grades, is much higher than the learning lost at secondary or middle secondary. What are the best policies, the best strategies, really to kind of compensate the learning lost and at the early grades?
Well,
yeah, you can start. Okay, any one of you can. Okay.
Well, I can just give my own perspective. I think the sort of early grades learning loss is a very critical factor. But I think this again, I think whatever we want to do it at policy or strategy level, we really have to take the contextual aspect into our consideration, because early grade children coming from families with having resources to technology and parental education is different to children coming from with parents who are not literate and no access to technology. So this is a major thing that we need to consider, or probably we may have to have different strategies, because children coming with parental education and access to technology, the kind of strategy would be is to see how best we can even improve their further or maintain their skills or improve things better by looking at content and modes of delivery. But the problem with children coming from poorer backgrounds, they have completely lost out on it because 1 year of no learning and no access to learning materials, and parents cannot help. And this is a serious setback because they have lost and they have gone back by 6 months to 1 year of their learning skills. So how are we going to bring them on back into the place where they were before? That's the first question. More than that, the question we need to ask is, there is a lot of children who are actually dropping out of school. How are we going to bring them back into school? Because in fact, before learning loss, our concern about sort of ensure children are back in school, because a lot of them are, they say that UNICEF and UNESCO and World Bank estimations and even GP is estimating several thousands and millions of children are not going to come back to school. The longer this problem is going to go, that's going to be our major concern. So I think this really context and situation specific strategies has to be developed. That will be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Snev?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I absolutely agree, certainly, with this. I just from the European perspective, given, I mean, it's already very good to realize that it is the young kids who need extra support. So that is of such a great value to realize that, and hence to try to support them more. One possibility in Europe that we have taken in some countries is that if we close everything down, but we leave the primary schools and the preschools open in order to at least take care that these young children are not so traumatized by this situation, and that they can learn and go on learning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there is a question which is, this will be the last question, is for all of us, including myself. Yes, now we agreed there is a must for quickly to do research, even if it is very small, even if it is for only some groups. But they are asking about what are the plans after the research? Okay, we did the research. How this catch up? And I think both of you mentioned some strategies actually for countries to take for catch up, for flexible learning. How this can happen? How after we do the research, how can we really support countries and really to compensate the learning loss?
Okay, my sort of reaction would be is, it's actually will happen at all levels. First thing is, this learning loss studies will tell us a lot about where the data gaps are and where we need to focus our future data collection. So that means when we talk about EMIS at the country level, how are we going to strengthen the EMIS by including, are we going to introduce new sets of indicators that will also capture such issues like learning loss? Second thing is policy directions, and also what sort of frameworks we have, like curriculum framework and teacher standards. So do we need to revisit them and see, are we going to improve the teacher training, teachers' capacity to handle technology, things like that. So we need to look at policy perspective also. So these studies can also help that. Then finally, at the level of program implementation, how do we prioritize the funding as well as resource mobilization? So what will be our top priority in terms of ensuring that quality education is reaching sort of every child? So that again, the sort of SDG perspective we need to bring in here. So these research can also give us a lot of insights onto how do we prioritize and strategize. And then the final thing is, from an SDG perspective, these studies also throw new dimension about the value of psychosocial skills, life skills, and also the dimension of well-being and health. So often we don't link this up with student learning. Quite often it's treated separately. And we always see that we don't see the necessity to look into health data, nutrition data, vis-a-vis the learning. But now this pandemic has really shown that they are all interconnected. So it's high time that we again go back into this intersectoral approaches. So ministries should come together, work together, especially in early childhood as well as sort of primary education. We need this intersectoral approach, cooperation. So there are so many levels we can use this information going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Schneef, please.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I agree absolutely on the need for the data collection. And I think whatever kind of, if there's something centralized, organized, some kind of policy, then it would, for example, increasing the school hours or something like that, then it would be absolutely make sense that the governments not only think of implementing that, but collecting data on that, so that we later on can evaluate how good was this, how much did this help? Because as I said, we have strategies. Many countries use different kind of strategies. What's the best? We just don't know. And it would be good to learn. So I absolutely agree on this point. So there are these strategies. And as long as we do not know what is the best, you just need to do something, right? So and there are a lot, as I said in my presentation, there are a lot of things we can do. Keep the younger kids in school, improve the digital learning infrastructure, provide homes with books, especially for vulnerable children. There are strategies we can do. But the problem, one thing is important, the popular problem of that there were kids left behind. We always had, we had before the pandemic. We always had, we have in all countries. And there is a lot of research on how to build up education systems that less kids are left behind. And hence to also in the long term to think of the education system, to build in mechanisms to make access and learning opportunities more equal for children, to build on this literature which exists. That would be another major step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we now all agreed the importance of doing research, even if it is at small scales. I'll turn to Arabic in order to summarize. لابد من ان الدول ناو المدارس هتفتح. بعد فتح المدارس لابد من عمل تقييم للفاقد التعليمي، ثم عمل برامج إسرائيلية، برامج تعويضية تبنى على المرونة، تبنى على الإبداع، انترسكتورال كما ذكر فانكت، ان العمل يكون تضامني، invest more for parents, start with early grades، الدعم النفسي الاجتماعي للوالدين، الدعم النفسي الاجتماعي للمعلمين، التركيز والتعلم أكثر وأكثر، وحاجتنا في المنطقة العربية إلى ما يسمى digital learning. I think in the end, let me just thank Venkat and Dr. Schneef. Thank you, and also thank the partners, Dr. Abdessalam, أبيكس، مكتب التربية لدول الخليج العربي. شكرا كثيرا لرفعت صباح، رئيس الحملة العالمية للتعليم للجميع. شكرا لمركز الجودة والتميز في المملكة العربية السعودية، أذرع من أذرع اليونسكو للدرجة الثانية. شكرا لكم وشكرا للحضور. شكرا للزملاء الذين ساعدونا في هذه الندوة وفي الإعداد لها، أروم، مينغ هو، نانكينغ، نور، إلي. Thank you all. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء في ندوة قادمة إن شاء الله. Thank you all. Thank you.
بالتوفيق إن شاء الله. بالتوفيق.
Thank you all.
شكرا للجميع. شكرا.
مع السلامة.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
مع السلامة.
Bye bye. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye bye.
Education is a basic human right. Yet COVID-19 has left an estimated 1.5 billion without access to learning. And many millions of children will never be able to return. COVID-19 has led to a seismic reversal of education progress, which will also have a devastating effect on many other sustainable development goals, such as progress towards gender equality, with a disproportionate amount of girls being forced to drop out of school due to the pandemic. But this can change. You can change this. We raise over 1 billion voices for education and stand side by side as a global movement. We can and will achieve lifelong learning for all. So, together, we must call upon our governments to do the following. 1. Increase state funding for education to 20% of public expenditure. 2. Increase their tax base in order to increase resources, working towards a minimum tax to GDP ratio of 20%. 3. Enable urgent debt cancellation for the least developed countries and debt alleviation for middle and upper middle income countries. 4. Ensure inclusive educational system and institutions. 5. Provide free, quality education for all and end the trend towards the privatization and commercialization of education. 6. Improve the quality of teaching through adequate recruitment, remuneration, and continued teacher training. 7. Developed countries must work towards the goal of 0.7% overseas aid, with 20% of this spent on education. 8. Listen and respond to the voices of those affected. Space must be allowed for individuals and civil society to speak up. Together, we have an amplified voice to ensure we are heard loud and clear. We need you to write to your government and demand action, and share your story of how COVID-19 has affected your education on social media. Join the 1 Billion Voices campaign, and together we can reverse the trend and ensure free lifelong learning for everyone.